The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a crisp, impersonal envelope. How do you get evicted from a house you own outright, a house paid for with 40 years of a steelworker's sweat and a teacher's patience? The paper felt cold in Eleanor Vance's hand, a stark contrast to the warm mug of chamomile tea she'd just made. The worn spot on the floral armchair in the living room, its fabric faded to a soft, ghostly pattern, was where Frank had sat every evening, the newspaper rustling in his hands, his quiet presence a comforting, unshakable anchor in her world. Just looking at it, she could almost smell the faint, pleasant scent of newsprint and the pipe tobacco he only smoked on Saturday nights. The analogy was so cruel, it made her flinch. Maya placed a calming hand on her arm. Eleanor took a deep breath, picturing Frank's steady face. "He wasn't supposed to fire it at me, Mr. Davies. He was supposed to protect me with it." The lawyer had no response to that. After the deposition, Eleanor knew she had to see Leo one last time. Against Maya's gentle advice, she felt she had to. She found his new address, a cheap, transient motel on the industrial edge of town, through an old friend of his she managed to track down. She found him sitting outside his room on a stained plastic chair, smoking a cigarette. He looked terrible. He was thin, pale, and his eyes, once so bright and full of dreams, were hollow and haunted. The smell of stale smoke and despair clung to him. He looked up as she approached, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel, and for a fleeting, heartbreaking moment, she saw the little boy who used to run to her with a scraped knee, desperate for her comfort. Then the moment passed, and he was a stranger with her son's face. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a raspy monotone. "I wanted to look you in the eye," she said, her own voice shaking but firm. "I wanted to ask you how you could do it. To me. To your father's memory." He wouldn't meet her gaze. He just stared at the cracked, oil-stained pavement. "You don't understand what it was like," he muttered. "The pressure, the fear. I had no way out. And what about my fear, Leo?" She asked, her voice rising with a sorrowful anger she couldn't contain. "What about my fear of being thrown out onto the street at 73 with nothing? Did you ever for 1 second think about that?" He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled not with remorse, not with shame, but with a sullen, bottomless resentment. "It was always about the house, wasn't it? That damn house was always more important to you and Dad than I was." The accusation was so stunning, so profoundly, fundamentally untrue, that it stole her breath. And in that moment, she finally understood. This wasn't just about money or debt or fear. This was about something twisted and broken deep inside of him, something her love could never fix. The maternal love was still there, a dull, permanent ache in her chest, but it was now intertwined with a profound and liberating clarity. She couldn't save him. She had spent a lifetime trying. All she could do now was save herself. She turned and walked away without another word, her back straight, her steps measured. The journey back was far from over, but for the first time since that terrible Tuesday, she felt she was walking toward the light, not away from it. The courtroom was an intimidating space, all dark polished wood and ceilings so high they seemed to swallow the sound, a place designed to make an ordinary person feel small and insignificant. Eleanor sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Maya was on one side, a reassuring presence of calm competence, and a supportive Sarah sat in the first row of the gallery directly behind her, a silent, steady anchor. Across the aisle, Leo sat with his court-appointed attorney, looking like a ghost in an ill-fitting suit. He never once made eye contact with her. The legal team for Sparrow Homes LLC was at the next table, a phalanx of expensive suits and leather briefcases, whispering among themselves. The civil trial was a grueling affair that stretched over 3 days. Mr. Davies, the developer's lawyer, was as smug and aggressive as he had been at the injunction hearing. Eleanor believed in simple, unshakable truths, principles forged in the Great Depression by her parents and tempered by a life of practicality. Work hard, save your money, love your family, and never ever buy on credit what you can't pay for in cash. Frank had been the same, a man of solid, earthy convictions. A foreman at the steel mill for 4 decades, he treated debt like a contagion. He tried to paint Eleanor as a vindictive mother, angry at her son's business failures, who was now trying to unwind a legitimate deal out of spite. He brought up the power of attorney repeatedly, holding the document aloft for the judge to see. A legally executed notarized document, Your Honor. Mrs. Vance is an educated woman, a former teacher. She knew precisely what she was signing. When Eleanor took the stand, her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. But as Maya began her gentle questioning, a strange calm settled over her. She wasn't performing. She was simply telling her story, the story of her life. She spoke of Frank, of their shared dream, of the sweat and sacrifice that had gone into paying for their home. She spoke of what the house meant, not as an asset, but as the heart of her family. With a clear, steady voice, she read aloud the letter Leo had sent her after she signed the papers, the one that so clearly revealed his true intentions. She described the cold shock of the eviction notice, the terror of losing everything, the desolation of her son's betrayal. During the cross-examination, Mr. Davies was relentless. He tried to twist her words, to confuse her about dates and details, to chip away at her credibility. But Eleanor held firm, her answers clear and unwavering. The core truth was her shield. "He was my son," she said, her voice filling the silent courtroom as she looked toward the judge. "I loved him, and I trusted him. That is the beginning and the end of the story." The turning point came when Maya called the shady real estate agent to the stand. Under a barrage of precise, relentless questioning about industry standards and due diligence, his confident smirk began to falter. He admitted the sale price was significantly below market value. He conceded that the urgency of the all-cash offer and the use of a power of attorney for a primary residence were unusual. Then Maya produced phone records showing dozens of calls between him and Leo's known bookie in the weeks leading up to the sale. The agent paled, and his testimony unraveled completely. The final witness was Leo. He mumbled his way through his testimony, a pathetic litany of excuses and self-pity. He tried to paint himself as the victim of bad luck and threatening people, a man with his back against the wall. But under Maya's sharp cross-examination, he couldn't explain away the damning letter he'd written. He couldn't justify draining his mother's savings account in the months prior to the sale. His betrayal, stripped of all its emotional complexity and family drama, was laid bare for what it was: simple, ugly, desperate greed. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a stern but perceptive face, delivered her ruling a week later. Eleanor sat in the same spot, her stomach in knots. The judge's voice was crisp and decisive. She found in favor of the plaintiff, Eleanor Vance. The sale of the house was voided due to fraudulent inducement and a clear, egregious breach of fiduciary duty. She ruled that Sparrow Homes LLC had not acted as a bona fide purchaser, stating they had demonstrated willful blindness by ignoring multiple red flags that indicated a fraudulent transaction. The ownership of 12 Sparrow Lane was to be reverted immediately to Eleanor Vance. The judge then looked directly at Leo, her eyes cold with disdain. "You used a document meant to protect your mother as a weapon against her," she said, her voice ringing with contempt that cut through the courtroom. "It is one of the most shameful acts of filial betrayal I have seen in my 20 years on this bench. Every single paycheck was divided with meticulous, almost ritualistic care. A portion for the bills, written out in his neat, blocky handwriting, a portion for the savings account at the local credit union, and a portion, in crisp bills, for the ceramic jar labeled Rainy Day on the mantelpiece." Leo was ordered to pay back the full amount of the sale to the developer, an impossible sum that would follow him for the rest of his life. The judge noted that the separate criminal charges for elder fraud were pending and would be dealt with by the criminal court. As the judge's words settled, a wave of profound, bone-deep relief washed over Eleanor. She sagged against Sarah, and tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back began to stream down her face. They weren't tears of joy, but of sheer, unadulterated release. The fight was over. Her home was hers again. Leaving the courthouse, she walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The world seemed sharper, more vibrant, the colors more intense, but the victory felt different than she'd expected. It was quiet, somber. There was no elation in seeing her son so utterly broken and defeated, led away by a bailiff. There was only a deep, aching sadness for the boy he once was and the man he had become. In the months that followed, Eleanor found a new equilibrium. The house on Sparrow Lane was no longer just a sanctuary, it was a symbol of her resilience. Walking through its familiar rooms, running her hand along the banister Frank had installed, she felt a sense of ownership that was deeper and more profound than any legal deed. She had fought for it, she had defended it, she had saved it. Her relationship with Leo was fractured beyond any hope of repair. He sent a single, rambling, self-pitying letter from jail while awaiting his criminal trial, a letter full of blame for others and excuses for himself. She read it once, her heart heavy, then put it away in a box in the attic. Forgiveness was a complex, distant country she wasn't ready to visit, and perhaps never would be. Healing, she was discovering, wasn't about forgiveness. It was about acceptance. Accepting the reality of what had happened, accepting the profound loss of the son she thought she had, and accepting her own strength to survive it. Inspired by her experience and urged on by Maya, she began volunteering twice a week with a local senior advocacy group. She would sit with other victims of scams and abuse, sharing her story, not for sympathy, but to show them they weren't alone and that they shouldn't be ashamed. One afternoon, she sat with a man named Arthur, whose nephew had convinced him to invest his life savings in a non-existent company. Arthur was consumed by the same shame she had once felt. "I feel like such a fool," he mumbled, staring at his hands. "It's not foolish to trust someone you love, Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice gentle but firm. "The shame doesn't belong to you, it belongs to him. The first step is realizing that. The next is getting angry. And the one after that is fighting back." In his eyes, she saw the same flicker of hope she had once felt in Maya's office. She found a new purpose in helping others navigate the same terror and confusion she had endured. Her story became a cautionary tale, but also, for many, a beacon of hope. She learned that while trust can be shattered in an instant, community can help you pick up the pieces. She learned that a legal document is only as honorable as the person wielding it. And she learned that the foundation of a home is not built on wood or brick or concrete, but on the strength and spirit of the person who lives within it. The core lessons of her harrowing journey were stark and clear. First, never sign any legal document, especially a power of attorney, without fully understanding its implications and having it reviewed by your own independent lawyer. They had taken out a 30-year mortgage and, through sheer grit and sacrifice, had paid it off in 22. The day they burned the mortgage papers in the backyard fire pit was one of the proudest of her life. Frank had held her close, his flannel shirt smelling of wood smoke and quiet triumph, the autumn air crisp around them. Trust is essential in a family, but legal matters require verification. Second, be vigilant. Unexplained financial transactions, sudden secrecy, or pressure to sign things quickly are all giant red flags. Elder financial abuse often starts small and escalates. Open communication about finances with a trusted circle, not just one person, is a powerful defense. Finally, never suffer in silence. Shame is the abuser's greatest tool. Reaching out for help, whether to friends, family, or legal aid, is an act of strength, not weakness. There are people and systems in place to help, but they cannot act if they do not know a crime has been committed. One evening, a year after the verdict, Eleanor was in her garden. The setting sun cast a warm, golden light over the yard. The scent of blooming roses, Frank's roses, filled the evening air. The house stood behind her, solid and secure, its windows glowing with light. The pain of the betrayal had not vanished entirely. It was a scar on her heart, a phantom limb of grief for her lost son that she would always carry. But it no longer defined her. She was not just a victim. She was a survivor. She was Eleanor Vance of 12 Sparrow Lane, and she was home. "This is it, Ellie," he'd whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "This is ours." forever. No one can ever take this from us. That sense of permanence, of ownership, was the bedrock of Eleanor's security. It was more than financial. It was spiritual. It meant she had a place in the world that was unequivocally, irrevocably hers. After Frank passed from a sudden massive heart attack 10 years ago, the house became her sanctuary and her companion. Its creaks and groans were a familiar language, a conversation she had carried on for decades. She knew the exact spot on the third step that sighed when you put your weight on it, the way the morning sun in July would slant through the kitchen window and illuminate the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden fairies, and the soft, mournful whistle the wind made when it squeezed through the old window frames in the attic on a winter night. Her finances were as orderly as her home. She lived modestly but comfortably on her teacher's pension and Frank's Social Security survivor benefits. She had a healthy savings account for emergencies, the result of a lifetime of canning her own vegetables, mending clothes, and turning off lights in empty rooms. She paid her property taxes the very day the bill arrived and kept every important receipt in a meticulously organized accordion file labeled with her precise schoolteacher's script. She trusted in systems, in ledgers, in the fundamental idea that if you followed the rules and acted with integrity, the world would be a predictable, stable place. Her relationship with her son, Leo, was the one area of her life that defied neat categorization, the one ledger that never seemed to balance. She loved him with the fierce, unconditional, and sometimes blinding love that only a mother can possess. She saw in his face the ghost of her beloved Frank, the same determined set of his jaw, the same dark, thoughtful eyes. The day the law declared her a trespasser was the anniversary of her husband's passing, the day she always spent tending to his beloved rosebushes. This wasn't just about losing a house, it was about being erased from her own life, a terrifying ghost in the halls she'd filled with laughter and love. But the truth was far colder than a bank error or a property tax mistake. But where Frank had been a builder, a man who found satisfaction in creating something tangible and lasting, Leo was a dreamer. He was always chasing the next big thing, a new business venture that was guaranteed to be a home run, a surefire ticket to Easy Street. There was the gourmet food truck that specialized in artisanal grilled cheese, which ended with a seized vehicle and a mountain of unpaid invoices for Gruyere. There was the revolutionary app for dog walkers, which never got past the expensive logo design phase. There was the plan to import rare olive oil from a remote Italian village, a venture that dissolved after the first shipment was held indefinitely in customs. Each one started with a burst of infectious enthusiasm that would sweep her up in its wake, and each one ended in a quiet fizzle of debt and disappointment. Frank had worried, his pragmatism clashing with Leo's boundless, reckless optimism. "The boy's got a good heart, Ellie," he'd say. His brow furrowed as he watched a 20-something Leo peel out of the driveway in a flashy sports car he couldn't possibly afford. But he doesn't have good sense. He thinks life is a lottery ticket he just hasn't scratched yet. Eleanor, ever the defender, the eternal buffer between her two men, would smooth things over. "He just needs to find his way, Frank. He'll settle down. He has your ambition." Now, in the terrible silence of her kitchen, Frank's words echoed with the clarity of prophecy. Years ago, about 5 years after Frank's death, Leo had sat with her at this same kitchen table where she now held the eviction notice. The afternoon sun had streamed through the window, glinting off the sugar bowl. He was starting a new consulting business, his eyes gleaming with that familiar, potent brand of excitement. He needed to secure a loan, he'd explained, but his credit was shot from the collapse of the olive oil venture. He'd been so earnest, so convincing, his words a soothing balm on her maternal anxieties. "It's just a formality, Mom," he'd said, spreading a thick document on the table between them, the legal papers stark white against the checkered tablecloth. "It's a durable power of attorney. It just shows the bank that I have you in my corner, that I'm a responsible guy with family support. It's for emergencies only. You know, like if you got sick and couldn't manage your affairs, I could step in and pay your bills for you. It's what Dad would have wanted. For me to be able to look after you." It made a painful kind of sense at the time. She was getting older, and the quiet, persistent fear of being incapacitated, of becoming a burden, was a shadow that sometimes flickered at the edge of her thoughts. Having Leo legally empowered to help seemed like a responsible, prudent step. The document was a dense forest of legal language she didn't fully understand, but she trusted her son. She looked into his eyes and saw the earnest boy she had raised, the one who'd brought her wilting bouquets of dandelions, not the man who had failed time and again. She saw what she believed was love, and she signed where he indicated, her familiar looping signature, a testament to her faith in him. He'd had it notarized at a small office downtown and had taken the original with him, promising to keep it safe. She'd made a copy, filed it away in her records under L for Leo, and had largely forgotten about it. It was a betrayal that had been signed and sealed years ago. Who had sold her life from under her, and why? The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a crisp, impersonal envelope that felt alien in her mailbox, a venomous serpent coiled between a familiar seed catalog and a benign letter from her pension fund. It was a safety net, she believed, for a future calamity. She never once imagined the calamity would be the safety net itself. That Tuesday morning, Eleanor's carefully ordered world tilted on its axis. The official letterhead, the bold, uncompromising font, the cold jargon, it all swam before her eyes. Notice to vacate. The words were a physical blow, knocking the wind from her lungs. 30 days. She had 30 days to leave the premises. The property at 12 Sparrow Lane, her home, had been sold. It was a mistake. It had to be. A clerical error of some colossal, absurd proportion. Perhaps a mix-up with another Eleanor Vance. Her first call was to the county records office. She sat on hold for what felt like an eternity, 20 agonizing minutes of tinny instrumental music fraying her last nerve. A harried-sounding clerk with a bored voice finally answered. Eleanor's own voice trembled as she gave her name and address, spelling out Sparrow as if the word itself was foreign. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the clerk said after a long pause, filled with the rapid, impersonal clicking of a keyboard. "Our records show a quitclaim deed was filed 2 months ago. The property was transferred and then sold. The new owner is a corporation, Sparrow Homes LLC. A corporation. The name was as sterile and faceless as the notice in her hand. "But how?" Eleanor whispered, her throat constricting, her knuckles white where she gripped the receiver. "I never sold my house. I would never sell my house." The deed was executed by a Leo Vance, acting as power of attorney for Eleanor Vance, the clerk stated, her tone flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were reading a weather report. The room went utterly silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to grow louder, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile shell of her composure. Leo. Her son. Her Leo. It wasn't possible. It was a grotesque misunderstanding. He couldn't. Her hands shook so violently she could barely dial his number, her thumb fumbling on the familiar digits. It went to voicemail, his cheerful, recorded voice a cruel mockery. "Leo, honey, it's Mom. Please call me back. There's been a terrible mistake about the house. It's very urgent. Please call me." She tried again, an hour later, her heart thumping with a sick rhythm. Voicemail. And again in the afternoon. Voicemail. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating as a winter fog, began to settle in her stomach. She spent the rest of the day in a disoriented haze, wandering from room to room, her hand trailing along the furniture, touching the framed photographs on the wall as if to reassure herself they were real. There was Leo at his 5th birthday party, his face smeared with chocolate cake and pure joy. There he was in his high school graduation gown, his grin wide and full of a future that seemed boundless. There was the last family photo they'd taken before Frank died, the 3 of them on the porch swing, wrapped in the warm, hazy glow of a summer evening. This house was her life. It was his life, too. He had taken his first steps on these hardwood floors. He couldn't have sold it. He just couldn't. By evening, the fog of denial had burned away, leaving behind a raw, desperate panic. She got in her 10-year-old sedan, its engine turning over with a familiar rumble, and drove the 45 minutes to Leo's apartment complex in the city. How do you get evicted from a house you own outright, a house paid for, with 40 years of a steelworker's sweat and a teacher's patience? The paper felt cold in Eleanor Vance's hand, a stark legal chill that seemed to leach the warmth from her skin, a jarring contrast to the fragrant steam rising from the mug of chamomile tea she'd just set on the kitchen table. It was one of those new, soulless buildings, with a sleek lobby that smelled of industrial cleaner and a doorman in a crisp uniform who looked at her sensible shoes and worn coat with polite suspicion. When she announced she was there to see Leo Vance in 8B, the doorman's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something that looked like pity. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Vance moved out at the end of last month, left no forwarding address." The finality in his voice was like a door slamming shut in her face. She drove home in a daze, the city lights blurring into long, weeping streaks through her tears. The full, monstrous weight of the situation crashed down on her. The unsigned power of attorney. The sold house. Leo's sudden disappearance. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a bol. It was a calculated act of breathtaking cruelty. She finally reached him by phone the next day. After calling his number a dozen times in a row, a frantic, repetitive prayer for him to pick up. His voice, when he finally answered, was distant and strained, heavy with an exhaustion that sounded more like annoyance than despair. "Mom, I can't talk right now." "Done?" "Leo, I got an eviction notice," she said, her voice cracking, each word a shard of glass in her throat. "It says the house has been sold. The county office says you did it. Leo, please, just tell me it's not true." There was a long, damning silence on the other end of the line, a silence so heavy and thick with guilt it felt like a physical admission. When he finally spoke, his words were hollow, stripped of all warmth, all love. "I'm sorry, Mom. I got into some trouble, some really bad trouble. It was the only way. I was going to tell you." "Trouble?" she choked out, the word feeling laughably inadequate. "You sold my home, Leo. You sold your father's home. This is everything we have. Everything we ever worked for." "It was just a piece of paper, Mom. A pile of bricks," he snapped, his voice suddenly sharp with a raw, childish defensiveness that cut her deeper than the truth itself. "I had people. They were going to hurt me. I'll pay you back. I promise. I'll get it all back for you." But the words were meaningless, empty shells. The trust, a bond she had thought as fundamental and unbreakable as gravity, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. It was the primal trust of a mother for her child, the bedrock belief that no matter what, they would protect you. In that moment, Eleanor felt a grief more profound and desolate than when Frank had died. Frank's death was a tragedy of the body, an act of nature that was senseless but not malicious. This was a tragedy of the soul, an act of will. Her son, her own flesh and blood, had looked at her, at her life, at the legacy of his father, and had seen it not as a home, but as a commodity. He had liquidated her past and her future to solve a problem of his own making. When she hung up the phone, the silence in the house was no longer comforting. It was menacing. Every shadow seemed to mock her, every creak of the floorboards a reminder of her profound, devastating solitude. She sank into Frank's armchair, the worn fabric offering no comfort, and for the first time in her 73 years, Eleanor Vance felt truly, utterly alone and afraid, and the foundation of her world had not just cracked, it had crumbled into dust beneath her feet. Days bled into a week of paralyzing despair. Eleanor moved through the house like a phantom, the eviction notice a permanent fixture on the kitchen table, a white flag of surrender. The day the law declared her a trespasser, of all the cruel ironies the universe could conjure, was the anniversary of her husband's passing. It was the day she always spent in the garden, her hands in the soil, tending to his beloved Mr. Lincoln rose bushes, their velvety red petals a living testament to his enduring love. Sleep offered no escape, her dreams a chaotic reel of visions, strangers with sledgehammers tearing down the walls, bulldozers plowing over Frank's roses, her wedding china being swept into a trash bin. She'd wake up with her heart pounding in the suffocating darkness, the scent of phantom dust in her nostrils. The simple routines that had once structured her days, giving them shape and meaning, now felt pointless. Why water the plants if they were just going to die? Why make the bed if she was just going to be thrown out of it? The grandfather clock's ticking, once a comforting heartbeat that had lulled her to sleep for 50 years, now sounded like a countdown to her own oblivion. She stopped answering the phone, letting it ring until the machine picked up. The shame was a physical weight, a leaden cloak pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. How could she explain this to anyone, that her own son, the boy she had raised, had stolen her life from under her? The betrayal was so intimate, so monstrous, that speaking it aloud felt like a second violation, a public airing of a private horror. It was her next-door neighbor, Sarah Jenkins, who finally broke through the wall of silence. Sarah, a retired nurse in her late 60s with a no-nonsense demeanor, sharp eyes, and a deeply kind heart, had lived next door for 30 years. She had watched Leo grow up from a tree-climbing rascal to a troubled young man. She had brought over a still warm casserole when Frank died and had sat with Eleanor in companionable silence. They had shared countless cups of tea and glasses of iced tea over the backyard fence, complaining about the squirrels and celebrating the first tomato of the season. She noticed the newspapers piling up on Eleanor's porch, and the fact that the curtains, usually drawn back by 7 a.m. sharp, remained closed. On the 8th day, she came over, not with a tentative knock, but a firm, insistent one that echoed through the silent house. When Eleanor didn't answer, Sarah used the spare key Eleanor had given her years ago for emergencies. This, Sarah muttered to herself on the porch, counts as an emergency. She found Eleanor in the living room, still in her bathrobe at 2 in the afternoon, staring blankly at the dark television screen. The air in the house was cold and stale, smelling of dust and sorrow. A half-eaten piece of toast sat on a plate on the coffee table, looking days old. "Eleanor? What on earth is going on?" Sarah asked, her voice, usually warm, now sharp with a nurse's professional concern. Eleanor finally broke. The story tumbled out, a torrent of grief, shame, and disbelief, punctuated by dry, racking sobs. Sarah listened, her expression shifting from confusion to shock, and finally to a quiet, simmering fury. She didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. She simply sat with Eleanor on the sofa, took her trembling hand in her own steady one, and when the whole sordid tale was finished, she said 5 words that changed everything. "All right, that bastard. So what's the first step?" Sarah's pragmatism was the splash of cold water Eleanor desperately needed, cutting through the fog of her despair. The first step, it turned out, was a phone call. Sarah had a nephew who was a paralegal. He couldn't offer legal advice, but he knew people who could. He gave them the number for the Legal Aid Society of Greater Cleveland. Making that call was one of the hardest things Eleanor had ever done. It felt like an admission of failure, of utter victimhood. This wasn't just about losing a house. It was about being erased from her own life, a terrifying ghost in the halls she'd filled with a lifetime of laughter, arguments, scraped knees, and quiet love. But the truth, she would soon discover, was far colder than a bank error or a property tax mistake. But as she sat by the phone, her hand hovering over the receiver, she caught a glimpse of herself in the hall mirror, a frightened old woman, her hair uncombed, lost in her own home. A spark of Frank's stubbornness, his refusal to be pushed around, ignited within her. He would never have let someone just take what was his. He would have fought tooth and nail. The voice on the other end of the legal aid line was young and brisk, but patient. Eleanor, her voice barely a whisper, explained her situation. She was connected with a lawyer named Maya Sharma. They scheduled an appointment for the following Monday. The thought of walking into a law office and laying bare her family's ugly secret to a stranger was terrifying, but it was also the first faint glimmer of hope she'd felt in over a week. On Monday, Sarah insisted on driving her downtown. The legal aid office was in a drab, functional building, a world away from the gleaming corporate towers that dotted the skyline. The waiting room was filled with people whose faces were etched with the same worry and hardship she felt inside. There was a young mother with a toddler, an elderly man with a cane, a man in a paint-spattered work uniform. Eleanor felt a strange, unexpected sense of kinship. They were all there because the system, or someone in their lives, had failed them. Maya Sharma was younger than Eleanor had expected, probably not even 30, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a calm, reassuring presence that immediately put Eleanor at ease. She led them into a small, cluttered office, stacked high with teetering piles of manila folders, each one representing a life in crisis. Eleanor, clutching a folder containing the eviction notice and her copy of the power of attorney, began her story again. This time, it was less emotional, more factual, her voice gaining a little strength as she laid out the timeline, the details, the final brutal phone call with Leo. Maya listened intently, her pen flying across a legal pad. She didn't interrupt, her focus absolute. When Eleanor finished, her story hanging in the quiet air of the office, Maya looked at her, not with pity, but with a kind of focused, professional respect. "Eleanor, what your son did has a name," Maya said, her voice firm and clear. "It's called elder financial abuse, and it is a crime. This power of attorney document is the key. You signed it, correct? You believed it was to be used only in case of an emergency, like you being incapacitated?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "He said it was to look after me. That's what we call a breach of fiduciary duty. He had a legal and ethical obligation to act in your best interest. Selling your primary residence out from under you for his own gain is the very definition of not acting in your best interest." For the first time since opening that envelope, Eleanor felt the ground beneath her begin to solidify. What had felt like a deeply personal, shameful failure was being framed in the clear, cold, objective language of the law. It had a name. It was a recognized injustice. She was not just a foolish old woman. She was the victim of a specific, prosecutable offense. Maya laid out a plan of action. First, she would immediately file a motion for an emergency injunction to halt the eviction. This would be a temporary measure, a legal firewall to keep Eleanor in her home while they fought the larger case. Second, they needed to file a lawsuit against Leo for breach of fiduciary duty and fraud, and also against Sparrow Homes LLC to have the entire sale voided. It was a betrayal that had been signed and sealed years ago, born of a mother's love and a son's desperation. Who had sold her life from under her, and why? Eleanor Vance, at 73, was a woman carved from routine and quiet resilience. "This will be a fight, Eleanor," Maya warned, her gaze steady. "Sparrow Homes LLC is a property developer. They buy properties like yours to tear them down and build condos. They won't give up the house easily. They will argue they are a bona fide purchaser, meaning they bought it in good faith, unaware of any wrongdoing. Our job is to prove they either knew or should have known the transaction was fraudulent. And as for Leo, this will mean taking legal action against your own son. It will be public. It will be painful. Are you prepared for that?" Eleanor looked down at her hands, the skin thin and spotted with age, resting on the folder that held the evidence of her son's betrayal. She thought of Frank, of his smoke-scented promise that no one could ever take this from them. She thought of Leo's cold, dismissive voice on the phone, calling their life's work a pile of bricks. The love she felt for her son was a deep and tangled root, an instinct that had defined her for decades, but the betrayal had poisoned the soil. "He left me no choice," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "He left me with nothing. I have to fight." The journey back began not with a triumphant surge, but with small, arduous, painful steps. The first was gathering evidence. Maya needed everything: decades of bank statements, tax records, deeds, and especially any correspondence from Leo that might show a pattern of financial need or manipulation. This sent Eleanor up to the attic, a place she hadn't ventured into for years. The air was thick and still, smelling of old paper, cedar, and forgotten time. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from a grimy, cobwebbed window. Surrounded by cardboard boxes that served as tombs for her past, the task felt overwhelming. Every box she opened was a fresh wound. She found a stack of letters Leo had sent from his first semester at college, full of promises and excitement about the future. "I'm going to make you and Dad so proud," he'd written in a youthful scrawl. She found a shoebox of his childhood drawings, a stick-figure family with wide, looping smiles standing proudly in front of a crayon rendering of the house on Sparrow Lane, the sun a perfect yellow circle in the corner. The irony was a physical ache in her chest. Then, in a metal lockbox where Frank had kept all their most important papers, birth certificates, car titles, his honorable discharge papers, she found it, her copy of the Power of Attorney. And tucked behind it, a folded piece of paper she'd forgotten existed. A letter. It was from Leo, dated a week after she'd signed the document. Reading it again, her blood ran cold. It was full of effusive, over-the-top thanks and grandiose promises. "Mom, thank you again for this. This is going to change everything for us. This investment is a sure thing. With this backing, I'll be able to pay you back 100 times over and make sure you're set for life. You'll see." At the time, she had read it as youthful optimism, the same she'd heard a dozen times before. She'd smiled, folded it, and tucked it away. Now, sitting on a dusty trunk under the single bare light bulb, she saw it for what it was, a confession in plain sight. He had planned this from the start. The power of attorney was never a safety net for her. It was a financial instrument for him. The phrase, "for us," echoed in her mind, a sickening perversion of family unity. Her life was measured in the rhythmic, sonorous ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding gift from her parents, its polished brass pendulum swinging with the steady certainty she had once believed governed the world. Her seasons were marked by the blooming cycles of the garden her late husband Frank had cultivated with calloused, gentle hands. She brought the letter to Maya, whose grim expression confirmed its importance. "This is huge," Maya said, her voice tight. "This shows his intent from the very beginning. This wasn't a moment of desperation. It was premeditated fraud." The next step was the hearing for the emergency injunction. Eleanor had to sit in a sterile courtroom across a polished table from a man named Mr. Davies, the lawyer for Sparrow Homes, LLC. He was immaculately dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her monthly pension, and he wore a cold, condescending smile. He questioned her for hours, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Mrs. Vance, you're 73, is that correct? Isn't it possible you simply forgot that you agreed to sell the house? Isn't it true, Mrs. Vance, that your son has been helping you with your finances for years? Perhaps you were feeling generous, and this is now a case of seller's remorse, a change of heart after the fact." Each question was a carefully crafted barb designed to make her seem confused, frail, incompetent, and unreliable. It was profoundly humiliating. But with Maya by her side, occasionally objecting with a sharp, "Objection, Your Honor, counsel is harassing the witness," and offering quiet words of encouragement during breaks, Eleanor held her ground. The fear that had paralyzed her was slowly being replaced by a cold, hard anger. She looked Mr. Davies in the eye and spoke her truth, her voice gaining strength with each answer. "My memory is perfectly fine, sir," she stated clearly, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "I remember the day my husband and I bought that house in 1973. I remember the day we paid it off in 1995. And I know for a fact I never, ever agreed to sell it. It was stolen from me. 2 agonizing weeks later, they got the news." The judge had granted the temporary injunction. The eviction was on hold until the case could be heard on its merits. Eleanor wept with relief when Maya called, sinking into Frank's armchair and letting the tears flow freely. It wasn't a final victory, but it was a reprieve. It was breathing room. It meant she could sleep in her own bed tonight. During this time, her community rallied around her in ways she never expected. Sarah was a constant, solid presence, bringing groceries, making sure she ate, and refusing to let her wallow in despair. Other neighbors from Sparrow Lane, people she'd only ever shared a polite wave with, started stopping by. Mr. Henderson from 4 doors down, a retired mechanic, offered to mow her lawn. Mrs. Gable from across the street dropped off a pot of chicken soup. Her old book club, which she hadn't attended in weeks, showed up at her door one evening with wine, cheese, and a new novel, holding their meeting in her living room as if to physically reclaim the space with friendship and normalcy. The crushing isolation she had felt began to recede, replaced by a web of support she hadn't known existed. The hardest part of the journey was confronting what to do about Leo. The civil lawsuit named him as a defendant, but Maya explained she also had a legal and ethical obligation to report the suspected crime to Adult Protective Services and the local police department's Financial Crimes Unit. This could lead to criminal charges. The thought of her son, her only child, going to prison was an agony unlike any other. For days she resisted, making excuses for him in her own mind. He was desperate. He was in trouble. He wasn't a bad person, just a weak one. But Maya was gentle but firm. Eleanor, people like your son, who commit these kinds of acts, often have a pattern. The house on Sparrow Lane wasn't just brick and mortar. It was a living archive of her existence, a repository of every joy and sorrow. The faint, layered pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe, starting near the floorboards and ascending to over 6 feet, tracked the growth of their only son, Leo, from a wobbly toddler to a young man who had to stoop to get through the door. If there are no serious consequences, he may do this to someone else one day. The shame you feel is not your own. It belongs to him. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them face the full consequences of their actions. One evening, wrestling with the decision, Eleanor sat in Frank's armchair and had a long, one-sided conversation with her late husband. She spoke of her anger, her heartbreak, and her terrible, conflicted love for their son. "What would you do, Frank?" she whispered into the quiet room. "What is the right thing to do?" And in the profound silence, she thought she knew the answer. Frank was a man of principle. He believed in right and wrong, in facing the music when you'd done wrong. He would be shattered, utterly heartbroken, but he would not stand for this. He would protect what they had built. He would demand accountability. The next morning, she called Maya. "Do what you have to do," she said, her voice heavy but resolved. A week later, a Detective Miller from the Financial Crimes Unit came to the house. He was a large, kind-faced man who took his hat off at the door and accepted a glass of iced tea. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Leo had spun his lies, and asked his questions in a gentle but methodical way. Seeing her own painful story written down in the detached factual language of a police report made it both more real and more horrifying. This was no longer just a family tragedy. It was a criminal case file. The police investigation into Leo's life revealed a grim, sordid picture. He wasn't just in a little trouble. He was drowning in it. He had massive gambling debts to unsavory people. The last business venture hadn't just fizzled, it had collapsed spectacularly, leaving him owing tens of thousands of dollars to investors who were now making threats. He had sold his mother's house for a fraction of its market value to a developer known for quick, predatory cash deals, a deal brokered by a shady real estate agent who likely knew the situation was deeply suspicious. The developers at Sparrow Homes LLC had gotten a prime piece of land for a steal. Maya's legal discovery process uncovered an email chain suggesting that, while they may have maintained plausible deniability, their agent had told them it was a motivated seller with a complicated family dynamic, and to not ask too many questions to get the deal done. This was the crack in their bona fide purchaser defense that Maya needed. The civil trial date was set. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of legal preparations, strategy sessions with Maya, and long, sleepless nights. The most dreaded part was the deposition. Maya had warned her it would be unpleasant. They sat in a sterile conference room in a downtown high-rise, the air humming with the sound of the HVAC system. Mr. Davies sat across the table, his smile gone, replaced by a focused intensity. For 6 hours, he grilled her, a court reporter's fingers flying silently across a stenotype machine. He picked at every detail, every memory, trying to find a contradiction. "Mrs. Vance, you claim you didn't understand the document. Are you saying you're incapable of reading plain English?" "No," she replied, her voice tight. "I'm saying I trusted my son when he told me what it was for." "So this isn't about a lack of understanding, but a lack of foresight," he sneered. You gave your son a loaded gun, and now you're blaming him for firing it?